Support for Trifles comes from the BSI Press. Manuscripts, collections of papers by international writers, and books covering a wide range of other Sherlockian topics. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And by listeners like you, who choose to support us on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/Trifles. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, Gables, Garridebs, and students all came in 3-packs, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? What's the difference between a gamekeeper and a gatekeeper? Between a Tregennis and a Tregallis? Between a Jack in office and a Mr. Cocksure?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Bert Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 288, A Note on the Priory School. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
And Bert, have you got your notes together today?
I do have my notes together. My quavers, my semiquavers, my hemi-demi semiquavers. I've got them all lined up.
You know, hemi-demi semiquaver sounds like it's the title of a 1930s song. A Cole Porter song.
I like that. It would be, I suppose it would be, the sort of song that, well, not Ruby Keeler, but somebody more like Josephine Baker would sing.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. Well, and all that jazz. So we will be getting to this episode where we're investigating an old piece of Sherlockian scholarship, kind of picking it apart. But in the meantime, the show notes for this episode are available at ihose.co/trifles288, all lowercase, ihose.co/trifles288. That'll take you directly to our website specifically for these show notes. And that website, of course, is SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. There you can find all sorts of things, including the ability to sign up via email if you'd like to get notified when we publish new episodes, or just simply make sure you are subscribed to this podcast on whatever platform you're listening to us on. And if you happen to be able to leave us a rating or review on Apple iTunes, or Apple Podcasts, that would be very helpful. And don't forget, at the end of every month, we do a drawing where you have the opportunity to win back issues of the Baker Street Journal, one of our sponsors, and every quarter we do a drawing for the ability to win a year's subscription to the Baker Street Journal. So check that out for as little as $1 a month. All of our Patreon supporters are eligible. Just go to patreon.com/trifles or just check it out in the show notes. Well, in this case, we find ourselves delving into a 1969 publication from Trevor Hall. Trevor Hall was a British Sherlockian, or is that a British Holmesian? Either way, he was a member of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London and produced a few tomes here of multiple essays. And in this case, we're taking it from the book Sherlock Holmes 10 Literary Studies. And I believe this is study 9, if I'm looking at the lineup.
Yes, I think you are. Trevor Hall was a wonderful character. I suppose I shouldn't call him a character. He was a chartered surveyor. He was a Leeds magistrate. He was director of a building society and an insurance company. And you say you're not satisfied. You say you want more of a background. He was the honorary vice president of the Magic Circle. So he was a fan. He was a magician, I suppose, and a fan of magic.
Oh, that's fantastic. I didn't know that. Yeah.
And we've chosen this particular essay by Trevor Hall for this series for a number of reasons, but primarily because it's a great example of a deep dive into a case. And in his note on the Priory School, Trevor Hall begins by exploring an odd remark by Sherlock Holmes. He says, and the interesting thing too is he refers to another book published some years before, because as Scott just said, this particular collection was published in 1969, but he refers to T.S. Blakeney's book, Sherlock Holmes Fact or Fiction, which was published in the very early 1930s. And Hall says, this fellow Blakeney, my friend T.S. Blakeney, conceded that he was puzzled when it came to the Priory School by Holmes' remark to the Duke about Reuben Hayes, the murderer of the German master Herr Heidegger. Holmes said, muses Hall, that although the gallows awaited Hayes, he had no doubt that he would be made to understand that it is to his interest to be silent. And Blakeney asked, why would Reuben Hayes, with no future but the scaffold, be able to see that it would serve his interest to keep his tongue quiet? I mean, Hayes, says Hall, was a pitiless villain with a strong reason for disliking the Duke, because, as he'd said, I have less reason to wish the Duke well than most men, because I was his head coachman once, and he treated me cruel bad. He sacked me without a character on the word of a lying corn chandler. So what? Now there's a. By the way, there's a. The corn. Now we've never looked at the wonderful profession of corn chandler.
You lying corn chandler, as opposed to an honest corn chandler.
Yeah. I wonder what a corn chandler is.
Is it just an insult he's hurling around, or is it an actual profession?
Oh no, it must be an actual something. I mean, now you could candle an egg by holding it up to the flame.
Yeah.
But you can't do much if you hold an ear of corn up to a strong light.
Well, maybe they were melting down the husks and turning them into wax for candles. Who knows?
Who knows?
Who knows?
Yeah. Well, anyway, so Blakeney, observes Hall, said, well, why wouldn't Hayes have thought it, really good to do all the harm he could to the Duke before he died and expose his clandestine love affair and the birth of his. The result of that, of course, was the birth of his natural son, James Wilder, and having that known wouldn't have pleased the Duke at all, who wanted to avoid scandal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this is the departure point. This is the leaping off point for Trevor Hall's essay.
Yeah, I mean, it's it really always puzzled me, and this is one of those throwaway lines toward the end of the story, where you take it at face value, but it had always puzzled me. Why should a man who has nothing left to lose think that he will do the honorable thing by remaining silent? And clearly, he's not an honorable man, right? And this is where we, as you say, where we begin to jump off with Trevor Hall. Incidentally, just to kind of close the loop on this, according to Webster's 1828 dictionary, a corn chandler, it says chandler, a dealer in candles, is supposed to be from the French chandelier. But what has this word to do with corn and ship in corn chandler and ship chandler? And these words, chandler seems to be a corruption of the Teutonic handler, a trader. So a corn chandler is, quite literally, a dealer in corn.
Oh, how interesting.
Yeah.
How interesting. Well, this Teutonic connection, oddly enough.
Yes.
Well, what a shame that Trevor Hall didn't pick up on that, because by the time we get to the end of the essay, we will find that there are some real ramifications here about that.
Absolutely. And why don't you begin to lead us there?
Yes, well, what Hall does is he then goes on. He says, I'm going to I will piece all these things together. But then he spends a little time talking about the date of the case, which pretty much seems to be in May of 1901. But the odd point about that is that both Blakeney and Hall make much of the fact that by the time of the case of the Blanched Soldier, Holmes was still clearing up the details of this particular case, and the Blanched Soldier happened in 1903. And so what's going on here? Because Hall says, you'll remember the Blanched Soldier, the strange business of Godfrey Emsworth, who was believed to have leprosy but didn't. And this was one of two cases written up by Holmes himself. And Holmes recorded the date of this case as a January 1903. And Holmes himself said in that case, it happened that at the moment I was clearing up the case, which my friend Watson has described as that of the Abbey School, in which the Duke of Greyminster was so deeply involved.
The Abbey School. That sounds an awful lot like the Abbey Grange.
Yeah.
And yet the Duke of Greyminster sounds like it might be the Duke of Holderness. So there's a bit of befuddling, of befogging going on here we're seeing.
Yeah, and Hall says, there are other people, he says, who've written about this, for example, H.W. Bell. But the issue here is, and Blakeney believed, T.S. Blakeney, whom Hall is referring to back in the 1930s, believed that Holmes, this whole thing that particular attribution might just become attributed to slipshod editorial work, lapses of accuracy in the names of the school and the Duke. Says Trevor Hall. This is the work of Sherlock Holmes, whose extreme exactness was constantly recorded by Watson throughout the canon. Holmes could not be accidentally guilty of such a blatant mistake, and I do not believe it, And Holmes' aside, contained in a printed account intended for the reading public, must have been accurate. Holmes was given to none of these faults. And then he reviews for a second or two William S. Baring Gould's comments about that particular passage. And Baring Gould believed that Holmes was, of course, referring to the Priory School. But that in the Blanched Soldier, said Baring Gould, that he was revealing for the first time the true names of the school and the peer of the realm involved, and that earlier in the Priory School, Watson had disguised all of this. And so this is one of the lovely things. At this point, we're about halfway through Trevor Hall's essay, but you can see him going back to Baring Gould, back to H.W. Bell, back to T.S. Blakeney, to sort of stitch his argument together.
Yeah, it's a wonderful example of using some of these, what are now legends in Sherlockian scholarship, but who were then, Hall's contemporaries or near contemporaries at a certain point, and well established as authorities in some of these chronologies and some of their suppositions. Well, we'll continue with the second half of Hall's analysis of the Priory School and what was wrong with it right after these words. Yes, we're in the middle of one of those Mr. Sherlock Holmes the Theorist episodes of Trifles, where we're looking at a classic piece of Sherlockian scholarship. Well, where can you find classic Sherlockian scholarship? Well, there are a couple of places, and we can think of one of them right off the bat that's available right now. It's The Grand Game, Volume 2, which contains Sherlockian scholarship from a variety of sources, mostly the Baker Street Journal, from 1960 to 2010. Volume 2 is all that's left because Volume 1 was so popular, it sold out. We'll have more news on bringing Volume 1 back from the dead in future episodes, but for now, get on over to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and pick up your copy of Volume 2 of The Grand Game. covering the last half-century of Sherlockian scholarship. You won't find better work in a single volume anywhere else. Go to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and get The Grand Game Volume 2 today. Okay, we are back, continuing with Trevor Hall's note on the Priory School. We pick up as Hall kind of rests his hat on having established the specifics via these previous experts, Baring Gould and H.W. Bell and Brend and Blakeney. And we are looking now at the case of the Priory School, that pseudonyms were not used in the Priory School, and it follows that Holmes felt it was expedient and indeed necessary to take the opportunity offered in writing up the Blanched Soldier to throw such dust as available in the eyes of his readers.
Yes, a desperate measure, says Hall, as the gap between the cases was only 2 years. And it meant that on this occasion Holmes was deliberately putting his reputation for exactness at risk. And, the risk that this ruse was successful in causing some confusion is amply demonstrated, says Hall, by all the things that we've talked about the timing. And this mysterious reason, whatever it was, caused Holmes to conceal the nature of his active but unpublished work on the aftermath of the case, which went on for 2 years after the murder of Herr Heidegger and after the apprehension and execution of Reuben Hayes, whom we may presume maintained his silence to the last.
And part of what is wrapped up in, I think, what's curious about the Priory School, at least according to Hall, is that Dr. Thorneycroft Huxtable himself, the headmaster of the Priory School, and this is interesting, claimed neither academic nor athletic success for his pupils. His establishment was simply the, quote, most select preparatory school in England. And, of course, he had the sons of men like Lord Leverstoke, the Earl of Blackwater, Sir Cathcart Soames, all have entrusted their sons to me. So clearly it was a very exclusive preparatory school, not necessarily because of how it churned out its students, but simply by virtue of it being, well, I guess a pre-gentleman's club of sorts for these young men.
Yes, and I think, Hall's point here is that the school is a very odd school indeed, without any reference to things like, academic or athletic success. And also, says Hall, Huxtable seems to be quite odd. According to Watson, the headmaster described himself as Dr. Thorneycroft Huxtable, M.A., Ph.D., etc., an assembly of titles. And boy, says Hall, this doesn't ring true at all, because it wasn't until May 1917 that representatives of the British universities, and this is 14 years after the events of this particular case, it wasn't until 1917 that representatives of British universities met to devise measures to encourage postgraduate study and research. And at that point it was resolved, says Hall, that it was desirable that a degree should be instituted carrying the title of Doctor of Philosophy, Oxford, of Doctor, Ph.D., obtainable by graduates after a course of advanced study. And this was discussed also in May 1918, and January 1919, and March. So Huxtable in 1901, being a Ph.D., his degree must have come from a foreign university. And he might have obtained it at Zurich, but it's much more probable that the university concerned was a German one.
Oh, again, these dirty foreigners, according to Victorian Englishmen. And he says it's unfortunate and somewhat suspicious that his card did not disclose the source of either of his degrees. If Dr. Huxtable was an Englishman, a question which now seems open to doubt, it can safely be assumed that he had European connections, and that the presence of Herr Heidegger at the Priory School may have had some significance beyond his ostensible position as the German master. So the picture, Hall says, now emerges of the Priory School as one being of more of a disquieting one. We've got a headmaster who concealed the source of his doctorate and of his European contacts, but who sought to attract pupils of sons of persons occupying high positions within the British government. And at least one of his pupils, was abducted and accompanied by the German member of the staff. Right? So Herr Heidegger was murdered without apparent motive by Reuben Hayes, who went to the gallows in silence.
Yes, and Holmes was engaged on some mysterious, unspecified work on the case for a period of 2 years after the abduction and murder had taken place, and considered it necessary to try to put people off the track by publishing a subsequent confusing reference to the affair, naming as the location a school of a different name. And Watson thought it wise to obliterate this connection with a vital document to which he had previously put his name. Well, says Hall, all of these oddities and concealments seem to me to point in one direction only.
And Holmes, having previously worked, not terribly too many years before that, 1895, having worked on a spy case. Remember Hugo Oberstein in the Bruce Partington plans. There, Holmes was working on behalf of the British government. Remember, Mycroft engaged him, and he was going after a spy ring that was after these Bruce Partington submarine plans. And Hall writes, others were there, however, to take Oberstein's place. Von Bork, a man who could hardly have matched among all the devoted agents of who could hardly be matched among all of the devoted agents of the Kaiser, had already been working in England on the most important mission of all for 4 years by the time we reach 1914 in his last bow. And he had been preceded by Baron von Herling, who had directed the spy ring for at least 2 years. And it follows that German agents and sympathizers were established in England for nearly 20 years before the Great War. So it can be scarcely doubted that the Priory School, with its remote situation, its odd headmaster, and its vulnerable small sons of the great and famous, had a part to play in the secret activities which were not revealed in Watson's text.
Yes, and then Hall says, we've heard something like this before. In the Reigate Squires, Holmes makes a remark, of course we do not yet know what the relations may have been between, these particular people in this case, but the result shows the trap was skillfully baited. And Hall says, that sounds like a conclusion you could draw about the Priory School. We may not yet know what the relations may have been between the Duke of Holderness and Thorneycroft Huxtable and Herr Heidegger and Reuben Hayes, but the result shows that whatever the trap was, it was skillfully baited.
And one interesting footnote here, both a literal and figurative footnote. Earlier in the essay, Hall had a literal footnote that looked at what Holmes was trying to do in terms of misdirection in the Blanched Soldier with the Abbey School and the Earl of Greyminster. He said the same deliberately confusing procedure was followed in the matter of the Second Stain, which was also a case involving a state secret of the utmost importance and international spies and secret agents. So it might be interesting at some point to kind of draw a parallel between this obfuscation with the Priory School with what was going on in the Second Stain as well.
Well, we've had so many references in the cases of Sherlock Holmes that these affairs, these matters of intrigue, these dealings with blackguards and villainy that involve so many of the first families of the kingdom, it makes it impossible, or it will make it impossible, to make the true facts public for many years.
And that is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
It's not.
I am a doctor, sir, and I assure you it is. You should have it attended. How did you come by it?
One of my dogs did it.